I want to say the views expressed here are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo's staff or board of directors. We want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components, for the underwriting grant that helps to bring you the following hour of World Watchers. The following hour of World Watchers is also made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. My name is Mae Brussell, and the program of World Watchers is number 827. It's October the 12th, 1987. Last week, for the last several weeks, I've been discussing parts of the connections of the OSS and William Casey to that very sensitive area of the Battle of the Bulge in a time period where American history in 1943 was to merge the OSS with the Waffen-SS, with Hitler's armies, and through various deals of American persons in power and certain banking investment firms such as Chase Manhattan and the Schroeder Bank and many international banks who desired this to be the way the world would follow as long as World War II would not culminate with the defeat of Russia. I'm going to take a week off and do some updating of the news and then get back to that very important subject next week. I could do that every week for the rest of the year or for many years, but I'm going to update some important news with you and then get back to that later. The newspaper Panorama in Italy had an article October the 4th, 1987, that was published. It has to do with a book called The Gelli Case. That's Licio Gelli. I've been talking about him in terms of being returned to Switzerland and his importance with the International Fascista and with the current administration. This new book is called The Gelli Case, and the author is Pierre Carpi, C-A-R-P-I. And what Panorama stated in their newspaper was that the book has been blocked by the Italian courts. It's not allowed to be printed, or else it's printed and can't be distributed there. And if it can't be there, it can't be distributed in America. And in this book, Carpi writes, in quotes, Gelli was the guest of the U.S. ambassador to Switzerland, where he received much protection, thanks to the intervention of George Bush, his great friend. As many of you know, I have referred to George Bush as Killer Bush. He's just announced his candidacy for the President of the United States. And for many years, I've referred to his role as CIA director when Air Cuba was blown up, when Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett were killed in Washington, D.C., and George Bush's links to the international fascista organizations. Along with the Licio Gelli story of his being in Switzerland now, the Miami Herald had a long article, longer than the Wall Street Journal one, September 27, 1983. It's titled Perón Crony Surrender, and his surrender stirs up bitter memories, and this has to do with memories in Argentina, where Licio Gelli set up the 3A. This was the death squad known as Argentine Anti-Communist Allegiance. And this article reminds the readers that 2 months before the appearance of right-wing death squads in Argentina, he called Mr. Lopez Rega that special units should be created to combat leftists, guerrillas, and others, not leftists, not communists, who oppose the government. Those were newspaper people, labor leaders, and then the wives and children or random kidnapping of these particular people. Gelli is the man who built the rat line with the Nazis, with the Vatican, and with the United States intelligence for Nazis to get out of Europe into South America, Central America, and around the world after the war. He was in the Waffen-SS. He was in the secret intelligence operations, the highest level of Mussolini. He fought in France and helped Franco set up his dictatorship. He was the head of the P2 Lodge, the front until he fled Italy in 1981, when it was revealed that many people, over 700 in the Italian government and others around the world in England, Monte Carlo, and Argentina were part of the lodge, and he was accused of setting up an organization not only in Italy but by an interior minister in Argentina at the time of these trials, as having the P2 as a huge criminal conspiracy on the verge of taking over the country. Licio Gelli in the Miami Herald is described again as being part of a team with former Admiral Emilio Massaro and the three-man military junta that presided over the Dirty War, where at least 9,000, it was close to 10 or 20,000, were kidnapped and secretly killed, that he was involved with the murder of a future ambassador to Venezuela from Argentina, Mr. Hidalgo Soyla, and when a newspaper man, Rodolfo Fernandez Pondel, wrote about it, he was kidnapped and murdered, and the P2 sent their emissary to be the Argentine ambassador to Venezuela. This article goes from the Miami Herald, the recent one, goes into many of the murders and mass murders that Gelli has been involved in. And several weeks ago on World Watchers, I, regarding the Licio Gelli story, reminded you of his links to Ronald Reagan, and thanks to a gentleman in San Jose who gave me this information about Panorama. He translates Italian newspapers for David Emery and myself, and he gave me the translation of the article that Licio Gelli was offered protection in the United States by Ronald Reagan, and that the Justice Department would take care of him in this country, that he wouldn't be prosecuted for any of these mass murders that take place. And this administration is very close to Licio Gelli. This is an administration that uses terrorism identical to Stefano Delle Chiaie and Otto Skorzeny, the men who set up what is called strategy of tension. We use terrorism as an excuse to really have a coup or a push, fascist push in the United States, and that's what George Bush would do and is doing. And his nomination, or his wanting to be nominated as head of the Republican Party, is in line with his close relationship with Licio Gelli. George Bush's brother, Prescott Bush, is a Knight of Malta and is part of the Vatican entourage that not only fund the Contras, but have set up death squads and have been linked to Michele Sindona, who was given cyanide in an Italian jail, or Roberta Calvi, who was hung in London. Stefano Delle Chiaie is a terrorist partner of Licio Gelli's, who I've referred to many times. And Chiaie was a principal contact with a man named Guido Giannettini, who was invited to the United States to conduct a 3-day seminar on the techniques and prospects of a coup d'etat in Europe, which also, given at Annapolis, could apply to the United States. The speech was at the U.S. Central Naval Academy in Annapolis, and this man works closely with NATO, as did Alexander Haig as head of NATO, when they were co-partner in the secret crimes and operations of coup d'etat with Stefano Delle Chiaie and Licio Gelli and the P2. So with Bush wanting to be president of the United States, it presents a really dangerous situation. Not several years ago, yes, it was, in 1984, on World Watcher 657, I talked about the links of William Wilson, the Vatican ambassador, to Paul Marcinkus and his interference with a case of Paul Marcinkus, who was the Vatican banker. He still is, linked to the P2 and Licio Gelli. Wilson is a Knight of Malta, as are the late William Casey and Vernon Walters and William Buckley, James Buckley, and so forth, a long list of persons in power who belong to this Vatican organization. Our Vernon Walters, who walked out of the UN when Daniel Ortega was speaking the other day. William Wilson, who's handled Ronald Reagan's personal finances since he was governor in California, was several years ago revealed as interfering with the Justice Department and the State Department on the cases of Paul Marcinkus and Mark Rich, and he was working with the banks in Geneva, Switzerland, going to the directors of the international banks to speak up for people like Paul Marcinkus, who were under questionable behavior and to be prosecuted, and Mark Rich. Mark Rich is the co-partner of the Sultan of Brunei. I mentioned him about several months ago on World Watchers, and they provide oil for South America by way of our ally Japan. And William Wilson was using these Swiss banks, and the paper from the Italy, the Panorama, is talking about George Bush's close proximity with the Licio Gelli of the P2, the Grandmaster, and giving protection in Switzerland by our U.S. ambassador. So the Reagan-Bush administration have been very closely tied up to the Swiss bankers, to the Vatican, to the P2, to the strategy of tension, to the death squads. As a matter of fact, Lopez Rega and Gelli's death squads from Argentina were working in Central America as soon as Somoza had been kicked out of Nicaragua. They were helping the Contras and our organizations fighting down there to get the government out of power until the Falklands War, when some of them were sent home to fight in the Falklands War. I don't know which U.S. ambassador was protecting Licio Gelli, because he fled Italy in 1981. He was in Switzerland for a while and then walked out of the Swiss jail, went down to South America. Then he went back to a Swiss jail just currently. But one of the most interesting and one of the most dangerous people who's currently our ambassador to Switzerland is Faith Ryan Whittlesey, Whittlesey. I haven't done programs on her. She was one of the people that helped sponsor Roberta D'Aubuisson into Washington about a year ago. She is a very, very far-right person who worked in the White House, and she was working under Director of the President's Office of Public Liaison with Michael Deaver, and she was so radical right, even for the Reagan administration, that Ronald Reagan offered her a job as a judge, and she turned it down to be U.S. ambassador to Switzerland. And her record with Oliver North and with General Secord and Hakim and the Swiss banks is one that came up at the time of the Iran-Contra affair, and I'll do more on that later. But Licio Gelli, according to this new book, owed such common courtesies that were given to him in Switzerland to his great friend George Bush by way of the U.S. ambassador to Switzerland. So it'd be interesting to know if he's referring to the current ambassador who's been there several years or so. Now, there is a new movie that just came out. It's not a new movie. It's an old movie. But it's very important in terms of the review it's getting now as against when it first came out. Many of you have heard of it. Many of you have read the book, The Manchurian Candidate. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article September 26, 1987. Shelved thriller gets new showing. The Manchurian Candidate, the John Frankenheimer-Frank Sinatra paranoid fantasy, putting paranoid in quotation marks this time, is a film about brainwashing that was made over 2 decades ago. It has reemerged 15 years after Frank Sinatra ordered it hidden from public view. He had the say on that particular movie. Dubbed at one time the Un-American Film of the Year by one film critic in 1962, The Manchurian Candidate foresaw a nation plagued by political assassination, congressional madness, witch hunt hysteria. It was based on Richard Condon's novel. Sinatra acted in it, he produced it, he bought all rights to it. Then he had it withdrawn in 1972 and decided now to let this bizarre film out of the bag for its first public showing in 15 years. Sinatra's lawyers and agents publicized that they had determined to let the movie's future take hold for whatever it is. You may see it now. Sinatra wants it back in circulation. It is an extremely popular film, and a whole new generation has never seen the film. The film, according to David Amram, who wrote the film score, said, "I imagine it's been out of circulation because of what happened in 1962. A year after it came out, John Kennedy was shot. He was also killed. And the film just disappeared. I think the time has caught up with the picture. Everything that seemed radical and paranoid about that film has come true. The political assassination, the brainwashing. The movie focuses on a brainwashed American hero played by Lawrence Harvey, who returns home from Korea to assassinate a liberal politician. It echoes of the Kennedy assassination, and its echoes prompted, this is what the Reuters story said, prompted Frank Sinatra to withdraw it as a courtesy to the Kennedy family. The singer was a devoted Democrat at the time, and I'll go back to that sentence in about one moment, but I'm reading the article from the Chronicle. Film buffs and Sinatra fans say that The Manchurian Candidate is only one of 2 political thrillers that were bought and shelved by Frank Sinatra. Suddenly, this is the second film, an obscure 1954 film, and to set you in the chronology, 1954 is when the CIA tested its muscles in overthrowing Guatemala, getting rid of Mr. Arbenz, and those same people from the Guatemala invasion went on to be part of the Bay of Pigs and to Vietnam and Korea, and the Iran had been overthrown, but then getting back to unstable or get rid of Khomeini. At this time, this team, that secret team that isn't so secret, have worked together since 1954. This film was made in 1954 when our assassination muscles were just getting into the waters, but the article says, an obscure 1954 film in which Sinatra played a presidential assassin. Critic Leonard Maltin at the time called it a thoroughly detestable role, and it was put into deep freeze by Sinatra. Sinatra was the majority owner of both pictures, and since they dealt with the theme of assassination, I assume, and he just assumes, he felt it might give people the wrong idea. And suddenly, the film has fallen into public domain, and it is considered a hot item among video buffs. This is the one called Suddenly. It suddenly was ahead of its time, sort of like Black Abductor. If you remember or don't remember, a book written 2 years before Patty Hearst was kidnapped that had the entire script of the Patty Hearst kidnapping that would take place 2 years later. This was ahead of its time. And then the article goes on, people come looking for it now. They say Lee Harvey Oswald saw it on Dallas television, and that his wife, Marina Oswald, testified as much before the Warren Commission. Now, this article says that because Sinatra was a good friend of John Kennedy, that he preferred that it go off the screen. Frank Sinatra, this alleged friend of John Kennedy, is the one who fixed John Kennedy up with Judith Exner while she cohabited the bed of Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana and John Rosselli of the Mafia are part of the secret team that were hired by CIA agent, who also was in the FBI, Robert Mayu, starting in May 1960. The death teams were set up by Sam Trafficante, and all this is in the affidavit of the Christic Institute. And the assassins were people that were close to Frank Sturgis, that were selected by Sam Trafficante. Among them, Frank Sturgis, whose name is also Frank Fiorini, who just happened to be in Dallas, Texas, at the grassy knoll the day John Kennedy was murdered, and admits that he was involved with going to Dallas for the purpose of the murder, November 22nd, 1963. The Manchurian Candidate, the movie or the book, if you don't remember it, was to imply that the Russians or Korean spies did brainwashing to get a person to kill a United States politician. And the whole theme of that was to divert it away from American assassins in the United States by the CIA and FBI, who hardly even need a brainwashing. They were hired by Robert Mayu and Sam Trafficante, people like Frank Sturgis, working with John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, the close friends of Frank Sinatra, who then they make a movie in 1962 and maybe make sure that when Lee Harvey Oswald returns from the Soviet Union by June 62, that he sees this movie. I looked up the index of my research on the Warren Commission hearings, and I don't remember Lee Harvey Oswald seeing that movie or her testimony on that movie. I'll have to look that up again. I don't know where they got this information, but that doesn't ring true. I remember there was an important opera he went to, The Queen of Spades, a Tchaikovsky opera that was in Russia that influenced him with the card, The Queen of Spades. And also, I believe in the Manchurian Candidate, there was this card of the Queen of Spades. I'll have to reread that. But this movie is now brought back for people to see because, in fact, the killings are part of our society and are accepted as not being even crazy or wrong, but a fabric of American society. Now, the New York Times discussed a long group of movies for their film festival. The Manchurian Candidate was brought back for it. The New York Times, September 13, describes the movie in this way, in a few sentences. The Manchurian Candidate, on its release 25 years ago, this devastating comedy thriller was seen as a parable of political paranoia. Subsequent events have proved the film to be less satiric than prophetic. And let me say, it wasn't prophetic at all because the people involved in the murder of John Kennedy had a role in the making of this movie. There was nothing prophetic. They didn't get this great vision. It was a matter of fact of something that was being planned from May of 1980 by Robert Mayhew and the assassination teams. The New York Times says the script, based on a book by Richard Condon, conjured up every frightmare of the early Cold War era. Witch hunt hysteria, Korean War, vet melee, congressional chicanery, and the tyranny of American mom. But none of the filmmakers could have imagined that political assassination would soon become an American blood sport. That's the way he described the Manchurian Candidate and political assassinations today as an American blood sport. Now, for those of us who read newspapers, who read a little bit of history, who knew something that preceded November 22nd, 1963, when we asked questions about the Kennedy assassination and mind control, and we as a collective, 10 or 12 people in the United States, and I was one of those 12 who began their research the day that John Kennedy was murdered, and we all eventually got to connect or know each other in one way or another after that. For years and years, we were described as crazy if we talked about mind control of assassins and went into the fact that these events can trigger a man to kill a candidate or a president in office. We took a lot of really crap from those people or critics who wouldn't study the evidence but made a profession of putting down anybody who thought such things. And now it's 1987, and we can see the role of Frank Sinatra with the very people who made the movie, himself and Judith Exner and Sam Giancana, John Rosselli, Sam Traficanta, and Robert Mayhew, and say, heck, these guys aren't prophets. They knew who they were seeing. They knew what was going on. And now the movie is out, and you can try to see these two movies, and I'm sure they'll be at the video centers if they're not there already. And speaking of secret teams going back many years, there was a top agent of the intelligence community who died just this past September by the name of Hans Toft, T-O-F-T-E, 76 years old when he passed away, former intelligence officer. And I bring up his name because I've had information about Hans Toft for many years. Might have mentioned him years ago on World Watchers, but because his biography or his obituary goes back again into the way the secret team works, I just want to cite a few things about Hans Toft. He was recruited from Copenhagen. He was living under the Nazi-occupied Denmark in 1941. He left Denmark and joined a British-Danish organization of the underground in 1943 that was allegedly anti-Nazi. Again, the 1943 year is when the Nazis went underground, when Fritz Kramer recruited Henry Kissinger, when Alan Dulles moved to Bern, Switzerland to start working with the Waffen-SS, SS Karl Wolff, Heinrich Himmler, and the Vatican. And 1943 is when OSS Chief Wild Bill Donovan recruited William Casey for setting up Gestapo and teams inside Germany by the time the war was over. That year was a key year, and this is when a man came from Denmark under Nazi occupation and volunteered for the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA. As an OSS officer, he worked for the Allies in Burma and Singapore, which would be with John Singlaub and his team over there. He helped establish supply lines to China. He then went to Yugoslavia. He was in Cairo. After the war, he worked for General Bedell Smith, who became director of the CIA. He was sent to Japan during the Korean War to expand agency operations, recruit pilots, and he directed propaganda against the Soviet Union from Japan, consistent with what the OSS had merged with the Waffen-SS for those purposes. General Matthew Ridgway credited him for collecting vital information on Korea, and he had a great knowledge of unconventional warfare. He was in the CIA after the Korean War. He worked on missions in South America, and he ran into trouble. This isn't in his obituary, but these are other articles I have. He ran into trouble with the CIA in 1966. It's the San Francisco Chronicle, August 13th, 1966. Suspended agent hints at exposing CIA blunders. Agent Hans Toft of the CIA indicated that he had inside information about the Bay of Pigs and the Dominican Republic and Vietnam operations that could create embarrassing issues for the CIA. And again, this is the group of organizations that tie into the Christic Institute secret team the whole gang that goes on to Southeast Asia and then to Central America and Iran. Hans Toft was suspended by the CIA when somebody came into his house and found papers, classified documents that he was not supposed to take home. Clark Mollenhoff said that Toft wrote his analysis of the Bay of Pigs, that there were serious blunders and also blunders in Dominican Republic, as I say, and Vietnam, and these papers were seized from his house. The CIA security made a raid on his home and seized these critical papers. He indicated, according to the San Francisco Chronicle, that he had a desire to expose and clean up the top personnel of the CIA, and he anticipated a difficult and bitter fight. He objected to Richard Helms becoming CIA director. He was writing a critique on Richard Helms, and he implied that Helms was one of those who planned and executed the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. All of a sudden, his papers were taken, and somebody came to his house, according to the San Francisco Chronicle, August the 3rd, 1966, and not only went to the home and took the CIA papers, but stole $19,000 worth of jewelry that his wife had. He's on a $25,000 a year salary, and $19,000 of jewelry was missing. The CIA didn't believe that he would go to the Metropolitan Police and complain about the jewelry being missing because of his role in the CIA, and along with the critique of the Bay of Pigs and criticism of the Dominican Republic and Vietnam, his house was raided, and after that he was retired, and we never heard much about Hans Toft. Oh, one of the important things about Hans Toft, in another article I have, is that he was one of the agents who was described as being given a law degree by John J. McCloy. John J. McCloy was one of the gentlemen behind Henry Kissinger's entering Harvard, releasing top Nazis from Germany. He was working with Earl Warren and locking up the Japanese in concentration camps in California during the war. McCloy designed the Pentagon building, a really, truly cold warrior who lived in France for 10 years prior to the fall of France, which was really arranged by the bankers and I.G. Farben. He represented I.G. Farben, and McCloy had given Hans Toft a law degree. On Toft's wall was a law degree from a well-known college, and the law office of John J. McCloy issued false law degrees for persons who were agents, just as I'm sure there are doctors with medical degrees who've never attended medical school who can interfere or get into certain cases based on those degrees. And because of the background of Hans Toft and also the relationship of John McCloy, who ends up on the Warren Commission, where people like Frank Sturgis of the Bay of Pigs are at Dealey Plaza at the time that John Kennedy is murdered. John J. McCloy helped cover up the murder of John Kennedy, worked closely with Hans Toft, and again, the merger of the Waffen-SS with the SS comes into people like Toft surfacing, leaving Denmark and going to the OSS, and then being a truly cold warrior and working with those secret teams in various countries, and then trying to make a critique. He is put literally on the shelf and lived quietly the past year since his house was raided, and those papers were found at his house. Now, the San Jose Mercury had a story this past Saturday titled, "Bank Record Snag May Delay the Iran-Contra Indictments." Did you wonder why nobody's been brought to trial yet while Lawrence Walsh is sitting in Washington? He rented an office for 3 years and the Iran-Contra hearings are over. I believe that if Bork were on the Supreme Court, if he had passed easily, then he could fire the special prosecutor. But it was known by the first week in October that Bork was not going to be confirmed, that the Senate Judiciary would not pass on Bork. So therefore, they may have to stop the Lawrence Walsh investigation and not prosecute at all. And what this article says, that independent counsel Lauren Walsh expects to face a new obstacle in obtaining crucial Swiss bank records. This could force a decision on whether to seek indictments or not against Oliver North and John Poindexter and several private citizens. Before the Iran-Contra hearings, he had sealed 30 indictments, and he can't decide. And this article says that Walsh has been turned down in terms of the Swiss banking records, and that if he can't have the Swiss banking records and a number of the key Swiss bank accounts, it will force him to delay a decision on criminal charges until early next year or even later. We'll wait till George Bush is president, and even later is when? And how come they're waiting for a piece of paper or two from Switzerland for indictments on the Iran-Contra affair? So the latest about the Lawrence Walsh is that a few pieces of paper that could be coaxed to be held up in Switzerland by our ambassador in Switzerland, who worked with Oliver North and Edwin Meese, and also the people that helped Licio Gelli and George Bush's friend, could really stop the prosecution of these people if they wanted to, and this is what seems to be holding it up. We'll take a 1-minute break now, and then I will continue with World Watchers, and this is just a half hour. I do want to thank you for the subscriptions and say that I'm getting out the invitations for the potluck party in case I'm late at doing that, and I am late at doing it, but they will come out. I promise I'll get them out this week. Set 2 dates, and I promise. I'm a promise breaker sometimes, but I'll do that. We don't want to wait too long, and I'll get the invitations out with a little map on how to locate my house and set the time that we'll meet and the date. If it's agreeable with all of you, sometimes I give a choice and set the date based upon the one that most of you prefer. September 17, 1987, Swiss open files tied to Iran case. Well, you'd think the files were available. Then when you read the article down further, it says the Swiss Justice Ministry said, however, that while a first installment of Swiss bank records was sent to Lawrence Walsh, the documents did not include any material related to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North or 3 other key suspects. Documents involving North and Major General Richard Secord and Albert Hakim and Manicure Gorbanifar are being held pending court appeals, and Mr. Walsh will not bring indictments in the case until most of the bank records have been reviewed. The bank records are being held up, and the New York Times said it is unclear when Mr. Walsh would be permitted to review the bank documents related to North and the other 3 figures. And according to the Swiss, Albert Hakim and Mr. Gorbanifar, who acted as middlemen, are still blocking the bank records, which means they can be blocked forever, I suppose. So what is the special prosecutor doing? Now, in regards to the nomination of Mr. Bork, Robert Bork, on the Supreme Court, the Wall Street Journal had a quotation of Mr. Bork's. It was an article by Michael Kinsley, October the 1st, 1987, and it refers to Mr. Griffin Bell, the former Attorney General under President Carter, speaking up on behalf of Robert Bork. And what he said, speaking to the panel up there in quotes, if we pick Supreme Court justices by what the people want, we're going to be in bad shape, end quotes. And, of course, Michael Kinsley writes that if you're talking about a nominee who's before these people, his claim was that he will honor the wishes of the majority. But Griffin Bell said, when you want the wishes of the majority, we are in bad shape. Now, speaking of Griffin Bell, Mr. Eugene Hasenfus filed suit this week against his ex-employers, Richard Secord and Albert Hakim of the Secret Team, and the Corporate Air Services. And, of course, Mr. Hasenfus' attorney on record to get him out of Nicaragua was the same Griffin Bell who doesn't want the Justice of the Supreme Court to be at the whims of the majority. Griffin Bell represented Hasenfus. Now, another article this week pertinent to these tangled webs of Iran-Contra, E.F. Hutton faces an indictment for money laundering. This is San Jose Mercury, October the 10th, 1987. Many of you long listeners to World Watchers know that I have been on the case of E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch, that they deposited a lot of heroin and particularly heroin money deposits into E.F. Hutton and to Merrill Lynch from the offices in New York City, millions of dollars in suitcases and cash. And the prosecutors in New York City want to get after E.F. Hutton for the money laundering of the mafia. Now, the attorney for E.F. Hutton, as I've said before, is Mr. Griffin Bell, who I could see would want his hand-picked Robert Bork on the Supreme Court, because some of these cases may indeed get to the Supreme Court. Griffin Bell is the attorney for E.F. Hutton, the company accused of the money laundering, which goes into massive billions. And also Griffin Bell is on the board of directors of E.F. Hutton. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the chairman of E.F. Hutton at the time of money laundering was a man named Scott Pierce, whose wife, Scott Pierce, is the brother of Barbara Bush. This is Vice President George Bush's brother-in-law. Scott Pierce was chairman of E.F. Hutton until just a few months ago, at the time of the money laundering of the mafia, and Griffin Bell is on the board of this company. So you see why these corporations would like to handpick not what the majority wants on the court, but why Griffin Bell, the former attorney general under Jimmy Carter, wants his hand-picked attorney on the Supreme Court with these kinds of cases going on. Now, as soon as Ronald Reagan is out of office, if not before, the prosecutors in New York are not going to hold up these investigations of E.F. Hutton, and you might have seen these articles. I just cited one coming into the newspaper quite frequently over the wire service. Now, another large article from the New York Times, September 28th, 1987, and this wasn't reprinted in papers that I got, and this is a whole-page article plus the front page, is titled, "Federal Witness in Pizza Case Recants the Testimony on His Mob Boss, the Mob Boss Salvador Catalona." Now, the whole pizza trial case in New York City that this fellow wants to open up again with lots of luck involved the importation of $16 billion of heroin into the United States from 1984 up to 87, and a suitcase of $1.54 million of cash from Miami up to New York City. And this was the Sicilian faction of the mafia family that ties to Henry Arsan, the P2, Licio Gelli. There's a very cozy relationship between George Bush, the P2, the Vatican, the drugs and arms to Iran, back from Iran, the gun running, and the drug importation into the United States. So as a resume, I've done many, many hours of broadcasts on these characters, but they're new again in the news this week with Hasenfus naming Secord Hakim of the secret team and the Corporate Air Services and Stanford Technology Training Group, and having that attorney Griffin Bell and then E.F. Hutton up for indictment with the money laundering, and then the pizza case opening up that ties into the money laundering. It gets closer to George Bush, so close that I believe maybe the system can't afford to have anybody but George Bush. He's so tangled with these operators. Now, just one quick item about Bob Woodward and William Casey that I want to do more later and through the years, of course. An article in the L.A. Times, September the 30th. You remember when Bob Woodward said that William Casey gave a nod when he spoke about the diversion of money, and the lead article is Woodward not sure. Casey was lucid when queried. This is when he gave his rosebud word, "I believe." But on television, Bob Woodward said that he was disguised as a priest. So if you're a priest and you're going to a dying man like William Casey, who's a Knight of Malta, all you have to do is ask some vague question, and thinking it's a priest and you're going on to the next world, which he was doing, I believe would make a very good statement if you're looking at the priest and you believe in God, and you certainly don't want to go to hell for what you are doing. Now, at the time of the air crash, Air Florida, in the Potomac River, and incidentally, the main characters in that tie into the Iran-Contra affair, and I'll do more later. Remember the broadcast where I said there was a person disguised as a priest going around to the survivors, and I went into the background of the CIA and disguising people as priests? Well, when in Detroit, when the airplane crashed, the Northwest Airlines crashed just this past September, there was an article in the San Jose Mercury, September the 14th, priest, in quotes, allegedly worked for a lawyer. And again, with this plane crash, for which there was no real justifiable reason, there were contradictions on why the plane crashed. There was a man who described himself as Father John Irish, who wasn't a priest at all, who was going around administering some kind of comfort to the survivors of some of those 156 people that were killed. And the San Jose Mercury has this article, priest, in quotes, allegedly worked for a lawyer. He wasn't a priest at all. And again, at the time of the Iranian coup d'etat, when Mossadegh was kicked out, and Kermit Roosevelt helped throw Mossadegh out and put in the Shah of Iran and the Pahlavi family, the key part of Kermit Roosevelt's activities were persons disguised as priests that brought about the coup d'etat. And Jim Hogan in the book Spooks writes about the use of a priest specifically, or other priests, plural, in the CIA and Lockheed scandal involved with Japanese payoffs. So with Bob Woodward coming in as a priest and William Casey, this religious man, saying, I believe, he could believe in God, and that would be right, seeing the suit and collar, and it has nothing to do with the Iranian diversion of funds. It just makes a good story. And I believe the rosebud of this story has to do with the garb, the clothing that Woodward was wearing more than anything else. Now, I want to talk about a contradiction, or not a contradiction, but a contrast of the way people are treated, politicians or appointed officials in our government, and ask a question, who makes the rules for the way people are thrown out or kept on the payroll as public officials? I'm thinking specifically of William Sessions. He's the FBI designate who was stricken by bleeding ulcers. He was flying to Washington, D.C. He was hospitalized. And on the airplane, before he arrived in Washington, D.C., he spit out blood. He was actually spitting blood, and this was reported in the newspaper. And according to the L.A. Times, October the 2nd, Sessions had asked for 2 weeks to prepare for his being sworn in the White House. But Ronald Reagan had planned to make a strong defense of Robert Bork, his embattled Supreme Court nominee, at the hearing. So he demanded that William Sessions be in Washington in 2 days and not 2 weeks. And having that pressure, he was on Delta Airlines and started vomiting. According to this account, he was vomiting blood. Now, Ronald Reagan visited him in the hospital, which he didn't do with William Casey, and said, that's okay, Bill, whenever you're well, you can be sworn in as CIA director. Now, Congressman Pat Schroeder gave a tearful farewell when she announced that she wouldn't be a presidential candidate. And the powers that be decide that Pat Schroeder or people like Edmund Muskie, who cried in Maine, are not capable of bringing presidential material. In accounts of Edmund Muskie's crying, many articles didn't mention that the GOP, the Republican Party, gave Edmund Muskie acid that forced his crying, which is all part of our history. It was part of Richard Nixon's dirty tricks, and that his crying was because of something ingested in a food or drink. Nobody says that Pat Schroeder wasn't given the same thing before she gave her speech, or that dirty tricks went outside the window. But ulcers is a symptom of stress. And Pat Schroeder was crying because of stress. But it is socially acceptable to cough up blood on an airplane when you're about to be sworn in, but it is not acceptable to cry on the outside. Our society allows you to bleed in the inside and bleed until you die if it's necessary. But when you show a tear to reduce the stress, and I would say Pat Schroeder is probably healthier than William Sessions, we can't see a salty tear or two, but a man can actually collapse in a coma and cough up blood, and that's all right. And I just ask the question, who determines that it is wrong to cry, but it is okay to cough up blood, that the pressures of these offices don't mean a thing? If you need to cry, you are out, even if you are chemically induced to cry, and who can resist that? And then if you hold it in, little boys are told to be big men, and you know all that crap. If you hold it in, then it's okay, no matter how your body suffers, even if you bleed to death. This is an important point, I believe, for people to consider and ask who determines what is weakness and what is strength. Now, I read in the newspaper this week, the San Francisco Examiner, that Mordecai Vanunu did not win the Nobel Prize for exposing the atomic or neutron bomb in Israel, but he won an alternative Nobel Prize. There is an alternative one called the Right Livelihood Award that is given to scientists. It's an alternative prize, and it was given to him by an international jury who was aware of his revealing the Dimona nuclear research plant in Israel in the Negev desert, where he said Israel had secretly built 1 to 200 atomic warheads, and more important, they had built, the award wasn't for exposing the neutron bomb, but the atomic warheads. Now, several weeks ago when we had a fundraising, I mentioned this woman in Germany who wrote to me and wanted to get tapes of World Watchers and how far World Watchers go. She called me from Germany this week and wanted me to start sending tapes. I hadn't answered her letter yet. And I asked her how things are over there, just a general question like, how do you feel? And then she burst open with a tale of how bad things are in Germany and how this talk of reducing weapons is just a cover for what is really going on. And she said all of Europe is talking about the neutron bomb. And I said, would you send me articles and I can get them translated? She said they are long stories. They cover a whole page. This is everywhere in Europe. They are talking about the neutron bomb, which is something that we don't get in this country any more than we get that book on Licio Gelli. But the deployment of the bomb has to do with France and Germany emerging as co-partners in a defense system and the security of having the neutron bomb at their side as they merge and practice their warfare exercises together. Now, in terms of elections of 1988, there was an article in the San Francisco Examiner, a little quip, Robertson sings those wedding bell blues, but Reagan wrote the song. It's about Pat Robertson's shotgun marriage. It also calls attention that Ronald and Nancy had Patty on the way, that Nancy Reagan was pregnant before they were married, as if it matters at all, except that the stories of Ronald Reagan when he was governor, not only his personal life, which is the least of it, but his financing with Mr. William Wilson, who has inroads in the Swiss banks and in the Vatican and so forth, his buying his property, his not paying taxes. The media was so kind to them, but they go into Pat Robinson's shotgun marriage. And then the paper this past week had an article, Jesse Jackson says his wife was pregnant when married, but the difference is that Jesse Jackson has told people all along, and that Pat Robertson lied and misstated the date of his marriage on his papers, as he did his military record. Now, going to the Bork nomination, again, besides the statement of former Attorney General Griffin Bell, heaven help us if the majority selects the Justice of the Supreme Court, there was a very important article in the San Francisco Examiner this weekend titled Bork's Defeat, How His Foes Pulled Together. And this is a lesson for all of us for the next elections to come. The Stop Bork effort, according to this article, and you might have read it, is a carbon copy of the media lobbying campaigns that were often engineered by the conservative groups and the people that got Ronald Reagan in. What they shared, the anti-Bork people, with the earlier efforts, comparing their work to the Reagan apparatus, was a committed core, a hard committed core of ideologues who gave up their individual reasons or arguments and their individual organizations for total dedication to a single goal. Now, in 1980, I was saying, and over and on the air, anybody but Reagan. That should be the deciding factor, not John Anderson, not Jesse Jackson, not who the third party is, and the Peace and Freedom Party, and all these splinter groups. It should be anybody but Reagan. And if it was anybody but Reagan, we wouldn't have the ships in the Persian Gulf today getting ready for World War III. Reagan referred to himself in terms of his not having to announce prior to declaring a war that he said, I am, in quotes, commander-in-chief. And commander-in-chief are the key words that I have warned about Reagan for years. He has identified himself with Franklin Roosevelt, with a third term, with a war. And he said, I don't want the Wars Power Act to interfere with me because, he said, I am commander-in-chief. Now, that's in his head. It's not in the Constitution, but as long as he thinks it, he makes it so because he believes he has that power. But getting back to this article, it the way Bork was defeated was by a total dedication to one single goal. It was a smart use of polling data, a clear-cut message, and most important of all, an iron-like discipline. Now, that iron-like discipline is the kind of way that I have to do my research. It's the way other researchers work, or people that get articles out or on radio programs such as David Emory or Nip Tuck. You have to decide your priorities, what you want in this world, and then you have to give up some things, whether it's the sports or whether, the coming ball games or whether it's some of these light frill movies and a lot of time-killing enterprises. You have to have a total dedication to a single goal and an iron-like discipline. And those words they used in defeating the Bork nomination are the only way to get what you want in this world. It's never going to come easy, and it's never going to come in depending that I elected a person. Therefore, I can't, or I can, or he will, or she will, or they won't, or what do we do? And this article said that a number of groups pulled together. There were over 300 groups that pulled together, and no single issue was allowed to be discussed at the expense of the overall plan that Bork should be out. And those are the key words for the next election, not I'll stay home because it doesn't matter, or what can my little interest do, or I belong to this group, or I belong to that group, and our organizations are doing it. A total dedication to a single goal with iron-like discipline is the only way to change this country, and that's what it's going to take, and that's why we got into this mess with the Heritage Foundation and the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Hoover Institute. Those think tanks were allowed to get as much mileage as they did in Young Americans for Freedom because the very people whose necks they were putting that rope around were sitting back, given titles, dumb titles like yuppies or whatever, and maybe they were yuppies or guppies, I don't know, and they sat back and thought, we'll turn into this new age, we'll go into ourselves. If we have stress, we'll massage each other. It's okay to have a massage, but the massage isn't going to take the kinks out of the society, and half the stress of the people I know who have stress, and I'm not putting down a massage, you can do your work and have your massage too, but a lot of the New Age was a diversion away from the hard work of rolling up your sleeves and having a desire for the kind of world you want. And it was this kind of awareness, finally, that broke through, and maybe this is part of the convergence change in our society of merging at this time our energies into a solid group and giving up our egos to change this world. Now, the another article in the Bork nomination that was important, lobbying for Bork disdained as inept. And this has to do, San Francisco Chronicle story, that people for Bork, such as Senator Charles Grassley and many of the right-wing Republicans, were attacking their lazy president, who they put in and thought was charming. Grassley said, in quotes, the White House was on vacation during August and asleep at the switch. While Ron and Nancy were riding horses in August, the opposition was organizing. The opposition outplayed us and out-hustled us. Well, Grassley should have seen who he was electing in the first place. All the evidence of who this man is, what a fraud he was, what a conniver to get you into World War III with all his mischief and dirty tricks. Everything you needed to know about Ronald Reagan was known in 8 years when he was governor here from 1968 to 1974. If anybody did hard research, even the Republicans, people like Barry Goldwater who feel deceived, they only lie to themselves, and when you lie to yourself, you only get back what you covered up, only it smells worse 10 times later. Now, Robert Bork will not take his name out of the court battle. You heard that this weekend. And Senator Gordon Humphrey from New Hampshire said, and this is very important, a vote by the full Senate is needed so historians and voters who are the villains who lynched Judge Bork will be seen. And as time goes on, I think votes against Bork will look less and less admirable. What he means is that as time goes on, these will be televised on C-SPAN and CNN, and in 50 states, wherever those people voted against Bork, a videotape will be made so that they will be up for re-election, or I believe they will get cancer, like Philip Hart of the Senate, Frank Church, Hugo Humphrey, Javits, go on. They could be poisoned like Adlai Stevenson. All the opposition or the other people who could have been spokesmen are dead, and a new generation are coming along. And everyone who's against Bork in the Senate has already been named. The names are in the newspaper. Republicans against Bork: John Chaffee, Bob Packard, Arlen Specter, Robert Stafford, Lowell Weicker. Those are four of them. Democrats against Bork are listed, and they're all listed. And so all they have to do is get their faces on the screen. John Glenn, Albert Gore, Bob Graham, Tom Harkin, Howell Heflin, we know how he's going to go. Inouye, J. Bennett Johnston, Ed Kennedy, you know his, John Kerry, Frank Lautenberg in New Jersey, Carl Levin of Michigan, Spark Matsunga from Hawaii, John Melcher, and so forth, Montana. What they want is the camera to get those faces. And don't think the Get Even team won't get even. It got even in 1975 after the Watergate investigation was over, after the Senator Frank Church committees began investigating what happened. You don't hear anything. Dead Wright Patman, who got into the banking scandals, and the various congressmen who investigated thoroughly those hearings are gone. The list of people on the committees, it's half obituaries. They're dead. And this is a very dangerous precedent for an administration and a group of people who have merged with the likes of those persons who illegally rearmed Germany after World War I, the Reinhard Gehlen legacy, the family of historians, and with what are death squads, such as Robert Brown was suggested to be part of with Lamar Hunt when he wanted to hire a team, American volunteer group, to kill 10,000 American liberal politicians. That was set up in 1962, the same year that Manchurian Candidate was made. So this is a very dangerous precedent, and Senator Gordon Humphrey says a vote by the full Senate is needed so historians and the voters will see who the villains were who lynched Judge Bork. Bork is no joke. Look at his face. He is absolutely no joke, and this isn't funny. And he is demanding to go before the hearing Senate, so it will be televised and photographed. Ronald Reagan doesn't want it. Those hearings can go on, maybe as long as Reagan's alive through the administration. A justice will be tied up. Bork has been told that, but that isn't the point. Tie them up, but identify them as being anti-Bork, because with Bork on the Supreme Court and having fired the special prosecutor before, he could salvage this president. He sailed along with mass murders, political assassinations, and cover-ups through his entire administration, and it was important to get Bork on. If he isn't on, they want the faces of the people who won't allow him to be on. Well, this concludes the first half of World Watchers. I'm going to take a break for a few minutes and then start with the second half of the program, which is your half. That's when you call in 375-3082. Have to remember the number here. That's your chance to call in and share what you've been reading or hearing or seeing. In the meantime, or before we end, I want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that brought you the past hour of World Watchers. And the previous hour of World Watchers was also made possible in part by Lowdown,